therapist in me. I'm not really. But also like the other part of it.
Tom, does it work from both? So, I think you're plugged in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
So maybe.
Oh, there it is.
Okay.
Definitely
How many undocumented people?
Because this one sounded like the mic was on. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you are.
And this one, the laptop might be on. No, we're going to sit over here now because the machine over there isn't working. So
It's not even like gets the deal.
No, well, there's so much, but the Canadian population is only about 10% of the U.S. population. But yeah, it's, even as a proportion of the population, it's definitely.
It's not sizable enough. Like.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there is it?
Have both screens.
Laptop, screen laptop.
What?
Do you want to have a microphone like this so you can walk around?
Sure.
People can hear pretty well here, right?
Close them in.
Really?
The floor.
Okay.
Plus, I think they're recording.
Oh, where did it go?
It is recording. It's not.
Hi, how are you?
How's it going?
Hey, good.
Not working. I'm not going to do start over. I'm going to do display and just see it.
I'm not involved with
You
that.
should, but it's not.
Emergency medicine.
Oh, I see.
It is recording.
Yeah, but yes, that's right.
I'm just worried if we do start over, it'll.
Thank you. Thank you.
You keep trying this, I'll try my laptop.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me I'm going to start it over.
This, no, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Plug it in a little bit, but it's fully charged. But you know, this doesn't have it, which is why I thought about it. Yeah. It's I don't know. It's like you're
Back to the other side.
it would work.
Okay, so
So I'm the medical geographer. But they
The only thing is I wanted to
Do a
show, yeah,
simulation.
yeah.
Well, I don't know about 101.
Is it, maybe it's the Mac display? Should we?
No, it comes with the Mac, that's your laptop.
That's why I
Yeah.
But I don't know what to stretch to get to like that. I don't know 101. It's always really bad.
Hey, well, we got Charlie back.
Okay.
I'm looking at it. Hi. Me too. Yeah, I just want the data.
Oh, right.
Reset room AB.
Yeah, so
Start over. You just did that already.
Where's David?
I think they both work. Yeah, no, you're on the. Oh, you know what? Let's give this a shot. And let's see if we just do this. And try to just go based on that one. Let's try that. See if that does any better. There we go. That's it.
All right. Okay. And okay, sure. And can I just use this to?
Yeah, I think it's a pointer too.
Yeah, we'll do that.
That looks odd. The problem could be that they've been left on.
They don't have any more battery.
I don't think so.
Just pointer, just. Otherwise, I can just do it from here.
Yeah, actually, laser pointers don't. Actually, laser pointer would work on that screen. I have a laser pointer. You want a laser pointer?
Just to be able to switch slides without having to be here. Yeah. All right, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. That's fine. Okay.
They're double A, triple A.
Fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming here today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Magdelena Cerda, who's here today to give us a workshop on agent-based modeling. Dr. Cerda did her doctoral training at Harvard School of Public Health, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship with the RWJ program at University of Michigan. And she started her faculty career at Columbia University and then was recruited to join faculty at University of California, Davis in the past couple years, where she is she's an associate professor in emergency medicine and violence prevention research. She is a social epidemiologist focused on social and structural determinants of health, focusing on issues such as violence, substance abuse, and mental illness. And thank you very much, Dr. Cerda, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here. So I'm going to be talking about agent-based modeling in epidemiology. And just as a small caveat, I'm not a modeler. I'm somebody who uses tools in agent-based modeling to pursue my interest in epidemiology. So because of that, what I'm going to be doing is talking about giving a conceptual overview of what agent-based models are, what their advantages and disadvantages as I see them are in application to epidemiology, the kinds of questions that we can ask in epi, and then I'm going to walk through a particular example of our own research to illustrate the different steps that you would go through in setting up an agent-based model. And then at the end, I thought we could open it up for discussion. If there's I think I have enough material for about 2.5 hours. If there's more interest, I can keep talking about other applications, or we can open it up for discussion, but we'll see at that point. Please feel free to interrupt as I go along. So again, this is the outline of what I'm planning to cover today. So what are agent-based models, or ABMs? What kinds of questions can we ask? And what are the steps involved in fitting one of these models? And then some discussion. So the interest in agent-based models and systems approaches in general, within which agent-based models fit, has really skyrocketed in the past, I would say, 10 years. Historically, they've been used in other fields, like, for example, in economics. They've been used a lot in infectious disease. But in areas of population health, and particularly chronic disease, they're a relatively new tool. And so in the past 10 years, there's been a real increase in interest in this area with a lot of conceptual papers, such as those shown here, among others, trying to raise the value of using agent-based models and other complex systems approaches, such as network models or systems dynamics models, as a complement to our existing toolbox that we use in epidemiology. So what are agent-based models, and why is there such an interest in these particular tools? So agent-based models are, in a way, in the simplest way that you can think of them, it's like you're setting up a virtual society, right? Like if you guys have ever played SimCity or any kind of computer game where you're setting up a virtual world, that's what agent-based models do, right? They set up a virtual world where there are agents. In our case, the agents represent people, but they could represent anything, right? They could represent animals, they could represent I don't know, organizational entities, whatever your unit of interest is. And what agent-based models are used for is to use computer simulations to study systems from the ground up. That is, from the micro level, seeing how dynamics emerge and population level patterns emerge at the population level from micro level interactions. And so with agent-based models, we can examine how individual elements of a system, that is, agents, behave as a function of their own individual characteristics, the ways that they interact amongst each other, and the ways that the agents interact with the environment. So you have three levels. You have the agents, you have their interconnection amongst themselves, and you have the environment. And then the idea is that there are these emergent properties that will arise as a function of interactive behaviors. And that will become more evident what I mean by that in a little while. So this is just a schematic representing the different characteristics of an agent-based model. So you have agents. These circles represent agents, and agents are interacting with their neighbors. They're placed within an environment. So this would be the environment. And the environment is characterized by a grid, right? So you have agents, and imagine in your case, agents are people. They interact with each other, so they're connected through a network. And then they also inhabit in an environment that has its own properties. And the characteristics of the environment, the interaction between the agents, and the characteristics of the agents all together function to produce population-level patterns of whatever outcome of interest you may have. Imagine cardiovascular disease, or in my case, violence. And there are certain properties that agent-based models have that distinguish them from other types of models. And so you may have seen, if you took a look at some of the papers that I sent around last week, that whenever there are conceptual papers on agent-based models, these different features come up again and again as some of the salient features that these models offer. So the first is that agents are autonomous. That is, they behave autonomously according to simple preset rules. So for example, there is no, within this simulation, there's no quote-unquote higher power that determines everybody's behavior. Each agent decides his or her own behavior according to the preset rules of the model and their own characteristics. Agents can also differ from each other on a variety of characteristics. So for example, we set up models that resemble the city of New York. So our agents are all heterogeneous. They all differ in terms of demographic characteristics, in terms of behaviors, in terms of individual histories. What's really nice, some of the really nice features of agent-based models are, first of all, that they allow for processes of feedback and adaptation. So what do I mean by that? So we know that for a lot of our health issues of interest, things are not, it's not just an exposure, it's not just that the exposure leads to a certain outcome and then that's it, right? Usually it's this way too, right? It's that the exposure leads to the outcome and the outcome influences the exposure, and it's a feedback loop. But a lot of the models that we use, other types of models like regression models, don't allow us to specify these kinds of feedback processes that may actually affect the patterns that we're seeing. So agent-based models allow us to do that. They also allow us to have agents learn from past experiences. And I will show what that means in one of the illustrations in a second, but basically you can specify a model in such a way that agents can adapt their behavior over time depending on what they've experienced. These models are also allow for dynamics. That is, they allow for the characteristics of agents and their behaviors to change over time according to certain characteristics and rules that you specify, and depending on what the dynamics you think are of interest. And again, I'll illustrate that. And also, one of the very nice features about agent-based models is that they allow agents to interact with each other. So in a lot of health issues, right, people don't function independently of each other. But in fact, the networks that they're embedded in matter a lot, right? You can think about that for infectious disease, but you can also think about that for drug use. You can think about that for violence, or a myriad of other health topics. Yeah.
So this seems to be in contradiction to autonomy to me.
No. So what autonomy means is that every agent can determine their own behavior according to their own characteristics and their own environment and their own network. Yeah. So within their own characteristics, the network forms part of that. Yeah. And you can also determine how much the agents will be influenced by the network within your rules as well. So the agent-based models allow us to specify ways that agents can be connected with each other in space and according to social links, and specify the ways that networks can actually lead to, for example, the diffusion of health behaviors or diffusion of health problems over space and across social networks. And so we can look at that, and we can look at how networks both influence, for example, selection of environments, and how networks in themselves can influence behavior. Finally, one of the main characteristics of agent-based models is that they allow for population-level behaviors and outcomes to emerge from individual characteristics. So what does that mean? It means that what you see at the population level is more than the sum of its parts. That is, what you specify at the micro level may not be what you see at the macro level. And so why is that important? So for example, if you want to model racial disparities in homicide, right? So in a regression model, maybe what you do is you'd specify race in itself as a determinant of violent behavior. Well, with agent-based models, you don't have to necessarily do that. You can allow those racial inequalities to emerge from the system. So it forces you to think about what processes within the system actually cause those higher level inequalities. And again, all of these will become hopefully more apparent as we go along. So just to give you, I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations of some of these concepts that are inherent to agent-based models. So the first concept that I just talked about was emergence. This really central concept of agent-based models is that patterns emerge from how you've specified certain processes within your model. And so what does that mean? So as an example, I'm going to show you what's called Schelling's segregation model. So Schelling was an economist, and he was interested in understanding how segregation patterns arise. And so he set up one of the first examples of an agent-based model. In fact, he didn't set it up with a computer. He just set it up, I think, on a napkin in an airplane. So you don't have to have a fancy computer to set up an agent-based model. It's more about the rules that you're specifying and how you're specifying agents within their environment that really drives what an agent-based model is. But what he wanted to look at was, so how do patterns of segregation emerge? And so how do individual preferences about where you live determine the population level patterns of segregation. Okay? And so what he did is he wrote down in a napkin, read a checkerboard. Imagine that that's like the first screen there, and he said that each red and green dot within this checkerboard has a happiness function. So he specified that the agents are going to be happy if 30 or more % of the other agents are the same color. And so then he started running the model at random, and he said, okay, at random, he chooses one agent. If the agent is unhappy because less than 30% are the same color in his environment, the agent moves to another place on the board where he's going to be happy, where there are 30% or more that are like him. And then he repeated the process until everybody's happy, or there were no more movements possible. So what do you think happened? What do you think was the final scenario? Was it that so what did with a 30% like you preference in the final model? What was the percentage of people alike per neighborhood? What do you think? What's your guess?
70.
70. That's close. So let me show you this model. So let me show you an illustration of this model to show you how it works. So this is an illustration of the Schelling model that's been presented in NetLogo. So NetLogo is a basic program that you can use to program agent-based models at a very simple level. And it's very nice if you're starting out with agent-based models to go to NetLogo, because they offer a lot of different libraries in which they show you examples that you can run through, and they show you, they describe all the information from the example, and so you can learn about how these agent-based models work just by playing through these examples. So this is an illustration of the grid that Schelling set up with the red and green squares, and we've set it up so that the percent similar wanted, that is the preference that we just talked about, is 30%. Okay? And so we start out with, at the beginning, the percent similar within these neighborhoods is 49.4%. And then, so then we allow the model to go, and we end up with almost 80% alike. So basically, what you see from this is that a property emerged from these micro-level behaviors, right? So at the micro-level, there was this preference. People are not really that discriminatory at the micro-level, right? They want 30% of people in their neighborhood to be like them. But what emerged at the micro-level was quite different, right? And what emerged at the macro level from this slight preference for similarity was a huge difference, right? Where it ended up in a hugely segregated environment where 80% of people were like them. So that's what emergence means, that these macro level properties emerge and do not necessarily correspond to the micro level preferences. Right? So the lessons that we can take is that what emerges at the macro level does not necessarily reflect what happens at the micro level. And that in this case, harsh preferences were not necessary to create segregation. So why might that be? What dynamics could have been going on at the micro level to lead from 30% to 80%, right? Huge jump. So I think that according to the model, it seems like there are two dynamics illustrated within this notion of tipping points. What happens is, so you have the neighborhood, right, and there are people like you, and then one of them goes away because they're not happy, right, because they're less than 30% like them. But then what happens once this person goes away?
Another one moves in, though. No.
Another one moves in, and what else?
I'm not sure.
Well, the new person might be unlike the other people, and then they move away too.
Exactly, exactly, right. Because if this person moves away, right, there might be less people like the rest of the people, and so then there are more people that are going to move away. And then if somebody else moves in, and he or she is not like the people here, then that's going to cause some of the previous residents to move out. And so all of these preferences, all of the consequences that emerge from the first set of behaviors are going to lead to this escalation of the problem of segregation. So this is what is meant by emergence, and it's also what's meant by dynamics, right? That it's not just, it's not just the exposure at a static point in time that leads to the outcome, but it's actually a snowball effect of multiple exposures over time. And one person's behavior is not only going to influence that person's health, but it's going to influence this person's health, and this person's health, and this person's health, right? It's all connected to each other. And so we can account for these dynamics, these interdependent dynamics, with agent-based models. I think there was a question over there. Is there a question? Yes?
I have a comment. I've always been of kind of mixed minds about this result from Schelling. I think it's a very elegant demonstration of all the points that you made. On the other hand, I think one reason it's been so popular is precisely this conclusion about harsh preferences are not necessary. It's really at variance with the reality of how segregation is operated in this country. There's nobody burning crosses on your lawn, no racially restrictive covenants, no redlining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people tend to use this to say, well, there's segregation, but it's okay. People just like to be with each other, and there's been, no problems here, move along.
I don't know that I would agree with that. I think I agree that it's a very simplistic model, and there have been, in fact, a lot of elaborations of the Schelling model since then. Recently, for example, with some sociologists like Elizabeth Brooke looking at much more complex patterns of segregation. But I do think, even though it is a very simple model, it led to, it created an interest in this area that actually led to a very rich elaboration of the segregation processes that have come later on. So for that reason, I would say I think it's still a valuable example. But I do agree with you that it is, in fact, a simplification of segregation processes. Yes?
But in more complex models, wouldn't you be able to account for redlining if you had?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So this is, right, this is a very, and you'll see from the example that we're going to go through, this is like the simplest you could possibly think of, right, in terms of an agent-based model. In fact, that he just wrote it out in a piece of paper. The models that you would see now are often quite complex, and you could incorporate a lot of those other factors. But I do think starting out, it's nice to look at the simple models because they illustrate some lessons very clearly. Okay, the second example I wanted to show is the example of AIDS, of the spread of AIDS. So this is, I'm going to show you another example through NetLogo. So some of the other characteristics that I just talked about that distinguish agent-based models are the fact that people are interconnected in networks, so people's behaviors influence each other. People are able to learn, so they're able to adapt from prior behaviors and from prior information. So I think this model provides a nice illustration of those two particular features of agent-based models. So what this model does is it has a population of people who are HIV negative. Those are the green people. And then there are people who are blue who don't know their HIV status, but they're actually infected. And then as you run the model, there's going to be people who are red, and those are people who know and they are infected. Okay? And people in this model can couple. So it's been set up, right? So you have in the model, it's been set up so that you have this distribution of HIV positive, HIV negative, HIV question mark. Also within the model, they've set up a rule where people can couple up. And if they couple up, it means they'll have sex. And that's what you see when people holding hands. That's what couples are.
Is it sex or unprotected sex?
Good question. Yes. So some other aspects of the model are that they're able to use condoms. So you can specify how many of your agents are using condoms with average condom use. Also, they're able to get tested for HIV, and the assumption is that if they're tested, it means they know what their status is, and it means they will use condoms. Okay? So those are the assumptions. Yes?
And does it have anything for serosorting?
No, I don't think so. What do you mean by that?
That positives tend to have contacts with positives and negatives tend to have contacts with negatives if they're aware of their status. Of course, not everyone's going to do that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any spread. But
no.
But an assumption like that could be built in, right?
Yes. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So within this model, they're able to couple and have sex. They're able to use condoms. They're able to get tested, and they're able to be committed. Right. That means they're able to have a commitment to each other, right, and stay in a relationship. Okay. And so the idea with this model is that you can simulate the impact that different types of policies can have on HIV infection. And so you can contrast, for example, abstinence only, right, with basically saying nobody's going to couple, to condom use or to testing. Okay? And so what's very nice about this model is that you can vary just one characteristic, right, one policy scenario, and that way kind of simulating the counterfactual, right? Same population, same conditions, you just vary one variable, right? So the first thing I wanted to show is how this concept of networks, right? The spread of behaviors across the network. And so this model, just by running it, so you have an average coupling tendency of 5. The people will have 5 partners, and then you can run the model and see how many of these become red and how, right? And so you can see people coupling up with each other, and some people are getting infected, right? And the infection rate is increasing. Okay? So that's just a very simple illustration, right, of one of these key features of the model, which is that people can interact with each other, people can interact with each other in a network, and the behavior of people affects each other, right? And so that's going to drive up, for example, in this case, the infection rate. People can also, so that's one scenario, right? Another scenario is that people, as I said, can adapt, right? They can learn from past information. So in this case, we'd see that by varying the average test frequency. So imagine that we change this from 0, nobody gets tested, right, for HIV, to 1. So people get tested on average 1 time a year, right? And so the idea is here, people get tested 1 time a year, they're going to change their behavior according to the test. If they get tested, they see they're positive, then they're going to use condoms. And so in that way, they're changing their behavior. So now if we run the model, and we see that there was still an increase in infection over time because of people coupling with each other, but the increase in infection was lower because people got tested and they adapted their behavior according to the testing. And so you can run this model with multiple scenarios and contrast how many percent infected, how many are infected if you increase the test frequency, how many are infected if you increase the average condom use, etc. So it's a nice way to contrast different types of policy scenarios, accounting for processes such as network influences and accounting for processes such as adaptation, the fact that people can change their behaviors over time. Any questions on this so far? Yeah, okay. So, right, so this model just shows the spread of disease across networks. It shows how disease emerges from individual sexual behaviors. It shows the role of adaptation, because it shows how agents learn once they learn they're infected, how they change their behavior, and it allows us to contrast multiple policy scenarios. So hopefully that illustrated some of these basic features of agent-based models and gave you a couple of examples of how they're actually run, how these models are run. There are some advantages of agent-based models if we contrast them to traditional analytic approaches. Luke and Stamatakis, who I think I sent this paper around, provide a nice summary of the advantages of agent-based models. And so I think, according to them, and I would agree, some of the advantages are the fact that you can look at non-linear patterns, right? So you can specify how non-linear relationships emerge over time, because there is actually no assumption about the functional form of any of these relationships. What you're specifying really are behavioral rules among agents within an environment. Because of that, also, you don't have to assume that the distribution of your exposure of interest, of your outcome of interest, of the error term are normal. It allows for non-normal distributions. It allows for heterogeneous actors. So again, to be able to model more complex processes than perhaps simpler types of simulations allow. It allows us to look at influences at multiple levels. So the individual, the environment, the networks. It allows us to look at dynamic processes with feedback. It allows actors to interact. And because of all of these, it allows us to look at disease processes within a more holistic framework. So agent-based models constitute only one type of what's called the system science approaches, or the complex systems approaches, which include agent-based models, systems dynamics, and network analyses. So in terms of which aspects, which advantages agent-based models in themselves offer, again, particularly they're very good if you're interested in looking at feedback loops, if you're interested in dynamic systems that change over time, if you're interested in specifying the interactions between multiple actors, and looking at dynamics occurring across multiple levels. And so to summarize this, I would say that some of the strengths that I see with agent-based models are that they specifically allow us to model dynamic interactions between individuals themselves, but also between individuals and their environments. So in that way, you can model with sources of endogeneity. So what do I mean by that? So, for example, I'm very interested in looking at neighborhood environments and how they influence people, right? And how they influence, for example, drug use, right? So what do you think might be sources of endogeneity or individual selection that might be going on when you look at this question? If you want to look at the causal effect of neighborhood, building dilapidation on drug use, what might impede you from doing that? Is everybody, randomly selected to neighborhoods?
No. I mean, there's a selection process. The dilapidated buildings and, the kind of populations that reside in those kinds of neighborhoods tend to be poorer and don't have as much agency when it comes to selecting where they live, and for a variety of structural reasons.
Exactly, right. So there are other factors, right, within individuals that lead people to select their neighborhood, right? It may be because of their socioeconomic status. It may be because of where their friends and family live. It may be because of their health, right? And these factors influence the neighborhood, and they also influence their level of drug use. So it's hard a lot of times, and when we do regression models to look at neighborhood effects on drug use, we are always concerned about this selection issue, right? How can we look at the causal effect of neighborhoods on drug use after having accounted for these sources of individual selection, right? That people are not randomly sorted into neighborhoods. Well, the nice thing about these models is that instead of just trying to cross out what these individual sources of selection are, we can model them. As we set up our model, we can actually think about what factors, what characteristics of individuals might lead individuals to select a neighborhood and might lead individuals to use more drugs. And we can specify those within the model and look at empirically how much these selection processes influence this association. So that's one nice thing about these models. Also, the fact that we can look at things at multiple levels of influence, right? So again, if I'm looking at drug use, I'm interested in how friends influence each other's drug use, right? So I'm interested in peers, and so how people are connected in networks and how these networks influence the diffusion of drug use. I'm also interested in the neighborhood and how neighborhoods influence drug use. And I'm also interested in people's level of anxiety and how they're self-medicating by using drugs, right? And so I can look at all of that together with agent-based models. The other thing I'm really interested in with,
when you say look at, there are two things you might mean, and I'm not sure which you're getting at. One is that you can specify a process linking those things in various ways, and you can see what the implications of different parameters are. The other sense is that you could try to estimate what those parameters are from the data. And are you talking about that second sense or just the first?
I think you could actually do both. But the first is what you'd start with. So you could actually specify the assumptions that you're making about those relationships within the model, and then try to estimate the parameters and do sensitivity analyses to see how robust your assumptions are about the parameters. But what I was talking about here is the first.
Yeah, because it's typically it's easy to imagine lots of causal mechanisms, and it's often very hard to get any kind of definitive resolution about what's going on.
That's right. Yeah, and so one of the things that what you have to do with agent-based models is constantly iterate, because the assumptions that you make about the causal mechanisms can completely change the results or not, the results that you observe. And so one of the nice things is that you can specify all of these things. But one of the dangerous things is that you can specify all these things. And so you have to be really careful about taking a very stepwise approach when you're adding any kind of dynamic to the model, and validate every step and see how robust these mechanisms that you've specified are to your assumptions before you move on to another thing. Because otherwise you may end up with this very nice looking web that means absolutely nothing. So it's a good point to raise. The other thing that you might think about, right, so again, I'm talking about, an example of what I know, but I'm sure there are other examples that you could come up with. So you can think about, right, the neighborhood influences your level of drug use, but then the level of drug use in the neighborhood is going to influence the characteristics of the neighborhood, right? So it's not only that neighborhoods influence people, people influence neighborhoods. And so I'm interested in specifying both of those, right? And seeing how both of these together, this cycle between individuals, their neighborhood, and their behavior, influences the patterns of, for example, violence or drug use that I'm interested in. So with these models, you can actually examine these feedback processes and see to what extent they actually matter in your behavior of interest. So at the same time, while they seem very tempting because you can look at all of these sources of endogeneity, network effects, feedback loops, individual adaptation. There's also some limitations, right? It's not that we're not saying in any way, shape, or form that agent-based models are the be-all and end-all, and we should scrap all, for example, regression-based approaches or other approaches and just go with ABMs. The ABMs are just one more tool we can use within our toolbox. And they come with their own set of limitations, like any other method. As I said before, they can become overly complex, right? It is very tempting to just keep adding on different characteristics, right? It's not like you're running, a trial of neighborhoods, right? You're not intervening in neighborhoods. You're just running a computer model. So it's very easy to add yet another layer to your model. But you can quickly lose control of what you're doing. So that's one thing to be very careful of. The second is that it's very data dependent. In general, there are agent-based models that are conceptual, and so they're data free. They're more to prove the concepts. But increasingly, these kinds of models are being used in a way that's reliant on data. And so the model is really only going to be as good as the data that you're using to parameterize it. And so in that way, it's inherently limited. And it's also very computing and time intensive. So the example that I'm going to go through, for example, which is a very elaborate model, took us 3 years to get to the point where I'm showing you now. And what I'm showing you now is a few graphs. So just to give you an idea that it could be quite an investment of time and resources to do one of these agent-based models. So I've talked about a little bit about what agent-based models are, what are their features, maybe some of their advantages and disadvantages. So, you're thinking about your own research, what kinds of methodological issues you are facing. Do these agent-based models address those methodological issues? So then, so if we know what agent-based models are, we have a general idea. What questions can we ask with agent-based models? Well, I would argue that there are many different types of contributions that agent-based models can make. First, I think they can help us with identifying multiple interdependent causes. So as I showed with the AIDS scenario, right, we wanted to contrast the influence of condom use to abstinence, to marriage, to testing, right? And so these models allow us to simulate those quote-unquote counterfactual scenarios within the same population, right? You have the same population, you had these people coupled up or not coupled up, and they all have a certain set of characteristics, and all you're doing is, you're changing X, right? And so you're looking at the same population, exactly the same population, with X or without X. Right? And so you're simulating an experiment without having to actually do the experiment, with all the caveats that I just said about the data dependence, of course, and the fact that it is just a model. You can model these processes of endogeneity, and you can examine spillover effects. So if you're interested in looking at multiple interdependent causes or multiple policy scenarios, these are very useful types of models to use. If you're interested in modeling selection issues, if you think there are issues of spillover in your population, these are very useful models to use. So that's one type of contribution. The second, if you already identify the causes that you're interested in, is explanation. So if you're interested in looking at mechanisms, right? Mechanisms, for example, that connect the neighborhood to drug use, you can look at all of those mechanisms through the agent-based model. You can use the agent-based model to specify the different processes that connect your cause to your outcome. You can also use it for prediction if you're interested, again, in assessing the potential effectiveness of different strategies. So like what I just said about, for example, condom use versus marriage, or quarantine versus treatment for spread of influenza, whatever different policy scenarios you might have. It can also help you generate additional hypotheses, and really, I think one very valuable thing is that it can help you identify needed data. So as I said before, with these models, they're very data dependent, right? And so you may set up a model or your idea of what the causal mechanisms are, and you say, well, in order to specify this model, I need a lot of data. And so that can help you see, well, where are the gaps in data that I need to collect in order to run a well-specified simulation of this process. And so if you're interested in asking one of those questions about identification of interdependent causes, understanding processes, predicting policy scenarios, I would say that I would particularly suggest using agent-based models if the question or problem of interest has one of the following properties. For example, if there are dynamics you're interested in, if there are networks, if there are processes of adaptation, and if there is no other simpler method that can answer the question, right? Because, again, agent-based models are just one tool that we can use to look at problems in epidemiology. There are many other tools that might be simpler and that might answer the question just as well. So I think it's really important when you're thinking about using agent-based models to be critical. A, what's the kind of question that I want to answer? Is this the type of question that agent-based models allow me to answer? B, does my problem have certain methodological issues that can be adequately addressed with agent-based models? C, is there a simpler way that I can answer the same question before I get into agent-based models? Because I think at least what I've seen is that there's a lot with new methods. There's a lot of excitement about new methods and about starting to use new methods. But it's also important to be critical about what you're using those methods for.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
From the beginning, I was thinking, what is the difference between this and the social network analysis? Or you said that it's a simpler method. What is the additional things from the agents?
Right, so the network analysis just specifies the interconnections, just specifies the characteristics of networks. So for example, the breadth, the size, the density of people within networks, and looks at the flow of information across the network. But it doesn't, for example, specify the multiple levels. So it doesn't specify, it doesn't place the network within the broader environment, and it doesn't specify the autonomous behaviors of people within the network. So you could place a network within a broader agent-based model, but it would just be a piece of it. Does that make sense?
So the environment is the additional complexity.
The environment is part of it, the autonomy, the feedback processes that can happen across levels. All of those are unique aspects of the agent-based model that you wouldn't have with a network. Yes?
So I have a question about networks that I might not get a chance to ask later because I have to step out. But so we're working on an agent-based model, a number of us in the room here, where it's a chronic disease. It's breast cancer, which is the outcome. And the network aspect of it are, as far as we can conceive of it, the kinds of behaviors that would be that would influence breast cancer incidence between individuals. For instance, age of first birth, or the choice to take hormone replacement therapy. But with cancer, you know, the length of time that a network functions to have an influence on the outcome can be quite long. So most of these agent-based models have arisen out of infectious disease or violence or something where the time frame is a little short. So do you have any insights into the application, the wisdom of using agent-based models for longer-term chronic diseases where the independent variables may act over a lifespan?
I think there's actually a real advantage to using them because of that, for that purpose. Because then you can actually, I mean, given your assumptions about what you understand about the latency period, you can model what the progression of disease would be over a long period of time, perhaps in a way that you couldn't observe with real data. And you could see how different assumptions about those latency periods would give you in terms of predicted patterns of breast cancer in the population. So even with violence, we're seeing that a lot, actually, with the effects of policies that we would have to assume an effect over like 10 years in order to see any kind of effect, something that we'd never be able to do in reality. So the agent-based models allow you to see those long-term patterns in a way that you potentially could not with real data. So I would say they would be very useful for that.
Good, thanks.
Any other questions so far? Okay.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So, but how dicey does it get then the farther out you go? Because if you're doing, for example, population projections, you don't want to go out too far because the assumptions you're making about what happens 30 years from now really affect what you're getting for your estimate. So is it a similar kind of thing that you need to think about, and how would you correct for that?
Yeah, and I think that's right, because the dynamics might change over time in a way that you can't predict right now. I think that's the case with any kind of policy prediction that you do, agent-based models or not. So it is just a prediction that you're making, and I think, you know, what we try to do is we try to dock the models according to what, you know, long-term trends tell us up to now. So can the model predict, so assuming that, you know, the end period would be now, and we have the data for the past 20 years, can the model predict that well? And so is it predicting the dynamics correctly according to the data that we have now? And so we have a robust model, and then can we predict out? But then, yes, of course, with the caveat that things may change tremendously, and so that might affect the outcomes. Okay, so I thought I would go into 2 examples of research questions that can be answered with agent-based models, but I think we've covered that pretty well. So what I'm going to do is, unless there's a strong preference to go over these specific examples, I'm just going to go into more of the model setup process, speaking about a particular example. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, so agent-based models can be used for many different purposes in population health. So they've been used a lot for infectious diseases. They're starting to be used for chronic diseases, especially for obesity, for health behaviors. We're using them for alcohol, for violence. They're used for health services. So they can be used for many different topics. Again, as long as I think methodologically speaking, substantively speaking, the question of interest can be answered with an agent-based model, you can apply it to any kind of topic you particularly care about. So then how would you go about formulating an agent-based model? So the first thing is you define the purpose of the model, right? You've decided that, you know, you want to answer a particular question. It's only answerable through these kinds of models. And then you engage in what's called the modeling cycle, this iterative process of setting up models. So you formulate a question, you assemble a hypothesis, you look at the patterns in your data before you've actually set up the model, and then based on the patterns you've seen in the data, you set up your model structure, you implement it, you look at the results, you look at the patterns. Are the patterns that you've simulated comparable to the patterns you've seen in your actual data? So that is your model well calibrated? And then you report the model. But of course, again, because any of these models have multiple pieces to them, you're going to do this a million times before you're done with your model, right? And so you may, for example, set up your hypotheses, look at the patterns, choose the model structure, analyze it, compare the patterns. Oh no, they're actually quite different from each other. What have I done wrong? What have I specified wrong? And so then you go again and again, right? Until you get to a model that you think is well calibrated and valid. So how do you start formulating the research question? I would really encourage the KISS principle here. Again, because it's very tempting to get very complicated very quickly because it's just a computer model and you haven't actually collected data on anybody, so it's free, basically. You want to keep a very simple question that actually has complex processes that can only be addressed with an agent-based model. So for example, one question could be, does spatial patterning of leisure time physical activity resources influence physical activity among working age women. So again, you can imagine patterning of leisure activities, right? Space matters there, right? The location of resources matters. There's multiple levels. So you can imagine how perhaps an agent-based model would help to answer that question. It's a simple, direct question. You start the model focusing on the most critical elements of the processes of interest, and then you add more complexity as you go along. So for example, if we're, we might be interested in the relationship between drinking and violence, right? And we want to set up an agent-based model because we think that there are multiple, processes that shape drinking and that shape violence that we need to account for. We start the agent-based model by just focusing on this dynamic, right? Then we add in, okay, well, how, for example, does the neighborhood influence drinking? How does it influence violence? How does space matter for the actual perpetration of violence? How does space matter for drinking? How do social networks, right, matter for drinking? How do social networks matter for violence? So you can see that I'm adding in layers, right? I start with a very simple process, and then I start adding in more and more layers as I go along, and the model gets more and more complicated. But at each step, I've calibrated the model so that I have a good handle on each of the particular processes. Okay, so those were just some very general ideas, right? Yes.
Yep. So your outcome there, violence, is very abstract. Would you typically have some data set in mind where violence is measured in some way, like the homicide rate or something like that?
Yes, exactly. So it might be the homicide rate, it might be victimization, non-fatal victimization, so it might be being hit, being shot, being, stabbed with a knife. Right, yeah.
But you would pick one of those, or you would?
Or you could do like
some composite.
A composite which represents victimization, yeah. Or for drinking, right, drinking could mean anything, so it could be light drinking, heavy drinking, it could be no drinking, so you have to specify all of that, yeah. And I'll illustrate that in a second. Okay, so far we've just talked about general ideas, right, about why these models might be good, how do you define these models, but it's hard to go, from those general ideas to doing anything, right, or to really having any kind of idea of how you'd use these models. So I thought that as an introduction to agent-based models, a good way to illustrate the process of modeling might be, instead of just, going dryly through step A, step B, step C, I would show you an example of a study that we've done using agent-based models. And at each step of the modeling process, I could show you what the steps were and how we got from those steps to the results at the end. And in that way, hopefully show you the kinds of considerations, methodological issues you can address with these models, the kinds of steps you follow through to set up a model like this, and the kinds of results that you can get. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about a particular example which is related to alcohol and violence. So before I get into the specifics of the modeling process, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about this study to help you understand the motivation for why we chose to use agent-based models in this case. So we're interested in violence, right? We're interested in reducing violence in cities. We know violence is one of the leading causes of death, especially for minority males. It's a particular problem for cities, and we want to figure out how can we reduce it. We also know that it's a problem that's linked to alcohol. So data shows us that alcohol is involved in an estimated 40% of violent crimes. So is there something that we can do about violence and its links to alcohol to reduce the problem of violence? Another thing that we know is that there are very important disparities, racial and ethnic disparities in violence. And the interesting and tragic thing is also that while blacks tend to drink less than whites. They also tend to abuse alcohol less than whites. They're more likely to die from alcohol-related violence than whites. So how do we address this problem? How do we reduce overall levels of violence? How do we reduce racial and ethnic inequalities in violence, and in particular in alcohol-related violence? So what are the best types of interventions that we could use to reduce alcohol-attributable violence and homicide? So we might think about interventions that consider equity and social justice, so particularly if we're interested in reducing disparities in violence. We might think about an approach that's cost-effective, that's efficacious, that has positive spillover effects, and that is feasible in the political reality, right? So one of the nice things about these models is that you can simulate different policy scenarios. Why would you do that, right? You're not just doing that because you think it's nice to look at different questions. You're doing it because hopefully it's going to be of some value, right, to policymakers. A very nice thing about an application of these models is that people use them to then advise policymakers about the types of measures that they could use to improve public health problems. So one way that we might address the problem of violence is by doing a population level approach, right? Following from the ideas of Jeffrey Rose, that you're going to get a much bigger shift in population levels of an outcome by doing a small intervention across the whole population than by just targeting the high-risk population. For example, here he did a comparison of systolic blood pressure among Kenyan nomads in the dotted lines and London civil servants in the solid lines, and he shows that there was a whole population difference in the distribution of systolic blood pressure, and the question was, how can we shift the London civil servants to look like the Kenyan nomads, right? So what can we do at the population level to shift the whole distribution of violence in this case, right? Okay, so how can we reduce violence related to alcohol? Our question was, can we reduce violence by intervening on alcohol? In particular, can we reduce violence by making alcohol less available and more expensive? There have been a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that show that making alcohol more expensive and less available reduces alcohol-related harms. But there was really no data available yet on what the relative impact of different types of policies that make alcohol less available and more expensive could be on violence, and in particular on racial ethnic inequalities and violence. So that's what we wanted to focus on. So again, if we go back to the motivations for doing these kinds of models, our motivation was to look at multiple different types of policy scenarios. So agent-based models allow us to simulate multiple different types of policy scenarios. So meta-analyses and other studies give us average effects across many heterogeneous subgroups. But remember, I told you that with agent-based models, we can make agents heterogeneous. So why is that important? Because we can look at the heterogeneity of effects across different subgroups. So for example, in our case, we were interested in the heterogeneity of effects across different racial ethnic groups. These models allowed us to look at that. Previous studies also did not account for dynamic interactions among perpetrators, victims, drinkers, and their environment, and we thought that was a particularly important thing to look at, and so we chose to use an agent-based model to do that. So our question was, would alcohol policies work to reduce violence in New York City? So one thing you could do is you could actually change the policies, right? If you actually had the authority to do that, you could go ahead and raise the alcohol tax, right? And see, does that reduce violence? Obviously, it would be very unfeasible that would actually happen without any kind of data to motivate such change in policy. So the idea that we had was, before investing in implementation or before making the argument to invest in different types of policy measures, let's estimate what the bounds of potential efficacy could be based on what we already know about New York, alcohol, violence, and the dynamics of place and time. So we wanted to ask, would alcohol-related policies reduce the problem of violence in New York? We had certain methodological constraints that we thought agent-based models would be particularly ideal for. First of all, is this issue of selection that I was talking to you about before, right? So that one of the nice things about agent-based models is that you can model these processes of endogeneity. Well, in our case, right, we're interested in alcohol measures and their impact on violence, but the problem is that people's drinking and people's violence happens across peer networks, right? But it's not just that people's friends influence each other, it's also that people select their friends, right? And so one thing to account for is not only peer effects on violence or peer effects on drinking, but it's also people's selection of more violent networks or of more high-drinking networks. Also, another idea is that, from the literature you might say bars, a high concentration of bars, might make people more violent, right? So there's some studies showing that in places with more bars, there's more violence. The tricky thing, again, is that it's not such a simple thing, right? It's not just that more bars means more violence, but it's also that people select bars, right? People select bars where there are people that are more like them. So we need to also account for people's selection into bars. We also need to account for people's selection into neighborhoods. At the same time that we need to account for all of these selection processes of peers, of bars, of neighborhoods, peers and bars and neighborhoods influence people. So we need to account for those feedback processes between people selecting their environment and the environment influencing people's behaviors. So agent-based models allowed us to model selection. It allowed us to model these feedback processes. It allowed us to look at factors at multiple levels. So again, why did we choose this type of model to answer our question? Because we were interested in a problem that had feedback processes between peers, between neighborhoods and peers, between neighborhoods and people, between outlets, alcohol, between bars and people. Because we were interested in a problem that had networks, right? People's friends, their drinking levels, their level of violence influence each other, and because we were interested in a process that had dynamics that changed over time. Thank you very much. So the alternative, right, that we could have done had we not done an agent-based model, the ideal alternative, or what we've all learned is the ideal solution to address any question about identification of a cause is to do a randomized trial, right? So the alternative to doing an agent-based model might have been we could have somehow gotten neighborhoods randomized to have more or fewer bars, or more or fewer, or cities to have higher or lower alcohol taxes. There's obviously a lot of issues with doing a randomized trial when you're thinking about policies that affect whole populations. So there's issues of feasibility and cost. There's also the issues that you want to isolate the effect of changing a single factor while holding all the other factors constant. But the effect of changing a factor may actually depend on all the other features in the system, right? And so that makes it hard to generalize the effect of one randomized controlled trial in one setting where changing X is going to change a lot of other features in the system to another setting. And it's also another thing that we want to look at when we're looking at policies is we don't want to only identify the effect of the policy on the outcome, but we also want to understand the processes through which the policy has an effect on an outcome. So agent-based models gave us a useful tool to do that because it allowed us to simulate scenarios where we only changed one characteristic, so simulating counterfactual experiments. We could contrast multiple hypothetical interventions at multiple doses to ask the question about, for example, how much would we have to raise taxes and for how long in order to have any kind of effect? That's something that you wouldn't be able to answer with a randomized trial because you can imagine you'd never be able to get the money or the political will or anything to be able to do 10 million different scenarios of 10 million different doses of taxation in the same quote-unquote population.
It also takes time.
But it also takes exactly, yes. It would take a long time, and as you'll see with these models, it could take you decades before you see any kind of real notable effect. And also, these models allow us to account for how peers, bars or outlets, and neighborhoods shape behavior. So it can account for social network dynamics, so how peers friends select each other and friends influence each other at the same time. Outlet dynamics, so how people select bars and bars influence people at the same time. And spatial dynamics, the fact that, you're not attacked in just space, right? The fact you may have a certain propensity to be violent, but the fact that that propensity ends up in you being violent depends on who's around you, right? Those spatial dynamics. And so agent-based models allow us to account for those spatial dynamics. So before, do you guys is this a good time to have a break before we get into the actual specifics of the model? Wait. Yeah? Maybe, how long do you take a break for? 10 minutes? Or?
Yeah, 10, 15 minutes. I think, oh, it looks like there's food or coffee or something out there, which is really good. I was going to say, we have to give extra time if we don't have coffee, because people might want to go for coffee runs. But since we have it here, 15 minutes?
Yeah, sounds good. Okay.
Thank you for recording.
So we don't
We're done with
You're weaseling him in, or you're weaseling out? I'm weaseling in.
No IRB anymore. Close that. Close that.
I felt.
Yeah. Did I miss much?
It's very related. Yeah. I would say that, like again, you could have a network within your agent-based model. It's just that the network is answering one of the models.
What is the connection?
Exactly.
No, but this is great. Just walk.
Yeah, we did. Yes.
And especially since it's like
I know, exactly. I was like, oh, okay, that's perfect. But I don't think that the like, for example, you could capture how people's characteristics over time influence each other on the network. But I don't think that, like, for example, the larger environment.
I like Liz Rice.
Yeah.
Individual level.
And the network. Yeah.
All right. I get
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What is drivers?
Yeah.
Not that individual, because you already have in this place.
I'll give another code. That's too much. You can give it the code.
I will.
I'm asking as a comment on
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what it's for. I mean, that's what it's going to be useful for.
What else?
I mean, I only did that so that I already know.
Yeah, we'll just be looking at it. About networks, about the environment, about the process changes, the patterns of the output.
Do you mind?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Okay, fine.
That's why I don't have to bend.
Yeah. How data parameters?
Nothing. I just.
It depends on how complex your model is. Yeah. Very.
We're on to you. We're like planning that.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a few papers on it. Maybe less. Less, maybe 1 year. Maybe 1 year. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So we were all getting different outcomes. And this person is
No, I think no.
That's right.
I think it's 1 year.
Steven says it's no. He's like never full.
But I didn't realize.
Like he's the one that always turns down the AC in our room. Yeah, he's
What happened to it? Fine, I mean,
the guy that I did.
Yeah, I took it.
Like variable.
You should try coffee.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we did that.
Yeah.
But like,
Oh, thank you. No, that's very helpful.
It's just good. It's not. It's a. I took the cord out. Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that
So there are a lot that are doing it already. No, you get that.
So I have never used TSR. So I'm not totally sure what the output is. Sorry. Because it's like ATE. Yeah.
same thing as ACE.
Yeah. But what are you match? What is the matching?
Okay. Oh, I already did.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. Okay, I see. So the second one is the propensity model. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's right.
Yeah. Not.
Right.
And then there's kind of this one where you're like,
So, I mean,
oh, you're categorizing your exposure.
yeah. And that's nice. Pretty nice. Kind of like base.
Yep.
so let me know what you think.
And I'll put it here.
Sure. Yeah.
So you know what I don't. This is why I don't know. Well, that's not the only reason, but mostly because I don't know like all the time I'm nervous about because I don't know what it is. So unless I like code it for myself. Like code, run the propensity model, get your predictive probability, calculate your propensity.
No worries.
Exactly. Which is really useful, right? There's like a matching.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, that sounds right.
But I just want, like, if I were to consider
if you don't, if you do margins after this, it should be
on outcome.
like, if you do margins after matching, like you can match and then run margins. That's the match.
They did
Match, run the regression.
Yeah, I did that. It's like.
Well, that's giving you a risk ratio.
Yeah, I think you can split it.
Are you sure?
Why are they
sorry, I'm so used to it. It might be for the same reason. Like, I think that TFX didn't exist when I learned, so I don't know what it is. I know it's like a But yeah, so it didn't.
There, I mean, you can still do it.
Yeah. I just can't. I don't like it. Like I don't like the mediation. It's bad. That's bad. Does something and I like never know when it's or when there's a problem.
Yeah.
Oh no. You should ask Natalie. How do you use TFX? I kind of.
Are they just emailing you like here, take it?
ACE, basic frequency. I don't know. I never used TFX. I just do my hand.
I mean, I wonder if it's like.
You can?
You just submit
I think you can. It seems like you can.
Yeah,
but
so
I don't know how to do it.
Okay. So you did like the AT.
Oh, no.
Or AT.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's the same thing.
So that's why it's like.
Yeah.
It lets you put in the frequency. It lets you put in the alpha model, frequency model. What band are you using? Epidemiology. You're using TFX?
You could do.
Yeah, you can do it apparently. So you put your model with your. No, it's in one line. Is it a conditional model? It has to be a conditional model on the match. Right? I think it margins because you're telling it.
Like I have this conference.
That's an online thing.
It calls it margins, then it gives me the. No, but I think what it's using is why do you use TFX?
Yeah, but I don't know the cause. I just want like
It's not giving her the baseline probability in the T0 group.
yeah.
That's probably I get a predicted probability if you matched. That's right. That's fine. Because you don't have like there is no there's match, so there's no yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Why? Because when I did it for my like 3 levels, I noticed it.
Yeah.
Right. That's great. You guys are
Right. It's good to get your match. The matching is match. Yeah, no, I'm just trying to think where you can create probability.
I have a 3 level exposure, and it gave me the baseline.
Yeah, when she does it with the 3 level exposure, it gives her a T0. No, it might not. It might estimate something. So everybody
involves
for that put everything in there.
So please notice that. I think so.
Oh, no. My husband is.
Yeah, I don't know what it does to me.
No one else thinks of it. Yeah.
Matched
Especially it's happened to Adam.
everybody in the name. Affect all of your other variables.
Cats like
Yeah,
that.
predict the probability.
Why not? I feel like
No, I wasn't surprised.
Well, it's meaningless though, right? Because like, who is that artist?
Yeah. Two of them do
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
There's
So
no.
it's meaningless.
Yeah, was it?
So we were like, when you created that,
They couldn't shoot.
Yeah, it was not.
They just were completely off.
Everything was dropped, not bombed.
Like, you go through a 10-game winning streak. The next game, one of them is going to go bad. Like,
our data is right up in your population is like that.
intrigued by what could happen.
Yeah.
I mean, if Draymond.
But I mean,
That intervention.
I mean,
yeah,
he
but like,
wasn't.
think about it from say I had people
Yeah.
sitting
Oh, I think they could. I think they have to shoot.
So when you go like where in age, I can't use that in my model. I can't then predict the effective age or have age affect the outcome. Age affect the outcome. Like
But when it is
Yeah.
the reason why we wanted to
Got to be a positive to that. How should we
it would just be through
I went
treatment.
to a
Just be through treatment.
full for me. Not the best.
Yeah, but maybe in the
Why
model,
not?
I don't know.
So we've been hanging out, and we're both quite busy, so we're gonna come in just a little bit.
Oh, really?
Be way better at
At least you're not sure you have time to watch these things.
I mean, I want to go out to dinner. So.
Okay.
Run them in just separate steps. Like, hey, you're excited about model, and then now the model using like different students, like music theory, different regression models. Why did you do that? Run. That's what I said. Yeah, do it by hand. Yeah, I would do it manually.
Yeah.
Probably not that much more difficult. You already have
You
a
guys
model.
have to do any nothing else for you guys, right?
Look at the.
Oh, really?
Think of that with the.
Are you like the Department of Public Health and Department of Finance, right? Not Public Health Science?
Yeah. I'm an epidemiologist, but I did violence prevention research on both based on emergency medicine.
Are they more
That's what Steve McCurdy is.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Or then you do like clinic
There's actually primary positions for social responsibility, and headed by someone for the gun violence.
like the ocean. Yeah, but sometimes
No, this is
they're going to put something in their mouth.
He's a
part of example of it.
I wasn't here.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Oh yeah.
Oh, that's the original meeting. Yeah.
Where I'm going to.
That's like zoning policy.
Yeah.
No, I have no idea what's going on. So I'm like, if I write it down, I might have
All right.
Archaeology.
So we get started again?
Oh, no.
You already did the model?
When it was on the subway, it was like that in the tunnel. Bill Thurston was coming out.
Okay, so I think we're going to get started again. So I'm going to go through this example of the study that we've been working on and going through what the steps were in setting up the model. Hopefully this will be, while it is focused on one particular problem and question, hopefully it will serve as an illustration again of the types of steps that you follow in modeling and the types of issues that you can address these types of models. So our study aims were to use empirical data and simulation to estimate the effect of 4 alcohol policies on alcohol-related violence and homicide in New York City. Why did we focus on New York? We knew New York very well. We could get a lot of data from New York. We knew about the policies in New York. We were all based in New York at the time, hence our focus in New York. There are a lot of racial ethnic disparities in violence in New York, so substantive and practical reasons why we focused on that city. So we looked at 4 policies. 1, what if we taxed all alcohol sales? 2nd, what if we just taxed beer? Probably a lot more feasible than taxing all alcohol. What if we closed bars earlier? Well, bars and liquor outlets. So when I talk about outlets, I mean bars and liquor stores, okay? And what if we zoned alcohol outlets so that we closed outlets in certain areas, okay? So based on that question, I can go into the specifics of how we parameterize the model. So Our model was an agent-based model simulating the New York population. We had agents embedded in neighborhoods. So again, our environment, right? I said that agents are connected and then they have an environment. Our environment of interest is neighborhoods. Your environment of interest could be anything you want it to be. It could be hospitals, it could be clinics, it could be schools, whatever you want it to be. Agents were able to interact with each other. They were also able to interact with police and with community workers because we were interested in the effect of alcohol policies, accounting for a lot of other dynamics that might be going on in neighborhoods, in particular accounting for policing effects on violence. And agents were able to experience violence. And then we simulated approaches to reduce violence. So this is in a nutshell our model. And so some things to notice here. First, I told you that the first thing you consider is the agents, right? So we have agents who have a certain set of socio-demographic characteristics. So for example, they have a race, they have an age, they have a sex, and they have a certain income. Agents are able to drink. They're able to be light drinkers or heavy drinkers or abstain. They also prefer certain beverages. Some prefer wine, some prefer liquor, some prefer beer. And then their drinking status is able to influence their violence status, so they're able to be either victims or perpetrators of violence. That is, they're able to either, for example, be shot or shoot at someone. And then some of the victims die. These behaviors, both drinking and violence, are affected by their environment, that is their neighborhood, so characteristics of the environment where they live, like, for example, the density of alcohol outlets in their neighborhood. They're also influenced by who their friends are, so how much you drink depends on how much your friends drink, how violent you are depends on how violent your friends are, and then there is a feedback process across all of this. So remember I told you that one of the nice things about these models is that it allows you to account for feedback processes. So neighborhoods can affect drinking, but drinking also affects neighborhoods, right? Violence, so neighborhoods can affect violence, but violence can also affect neighborhoods because people's violence determines where they move, whether they move across neighborhoods, and that's going to affect the neighborhoods. So we're able to account for circular processes. People's drinking is going to affect who their friends are. Their friends are going to affect their drinking. Again, we're able to account for a lot of these feedback processes to both affect how people select their neighborhoods, how people select their friends, but then also how their neighborhoods and their friends affect people's behaviors. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? I know it's a lot, but hopefully it shows you an illustration of what I meant when I said that we can use these models to account for feedback processes and selection processes.
Are you going to show us the actual how things are connected? For example, you have arrows that sometimes go into a box within the bigger box, and sometimes it goes just to the bigger box.
Yeah.
So this is modeled differently, I assume.
Yes, and I'm going to get into some of that as well. Yeah.
The main idea how you model these cycles is that, friends drinking at time 0 influences your drinking at time 1, which influences friends drinking at time 2. That's the basic idea.
Exactly. Yeah, like the Markov chains. Yes.
Are neighborhoods like a named list of neighborhoods, or are they points in space and then X distance from it is a neighborhood?
I will show you. But yes, they reflect named neighborhoods. Yeah. Maria, did you have a...
I'm just conceptually, should I think of these things as, these are all variables, not states?
They are states determined partly by variables. So you have so for example, each person within your model, their behavior, so their state, right? And their state at time t is going to be determined by their characteristics, which are shaped by variables in a model. But agents change states over time.
But these things, like racial ethnic composition, is that a variable or a? I mean, that's not a state.
it's actually, so it's not really a variable, it's something that arises. So imagine if you have the grid, right, and you have the dots in the grid, and the dots are different people. So some of those people are going to be black, some of those people are going to be white, Hispanic, etc. And so that's
it's a characteristic that emerges from the interaction.
Exactly. Okay. Yes. And so the same thing with the friends, right? You have a grid and you have people, and these people are connected to each other. And so you are friends. You know, you're in the grid and you're friends with this person, and that person. And those patterns are going to be what leads to the emergence of the social networks across the model. Okay. Does that make sense? Kind of.
But that's based on the demographic characteristics in the purple box, so that is a variable that then determines the emergence.
So it is a variable, and it's not. In the sense, okay, so for example, who you're friends with will depend on their, for example, sex and your sex, right? So in that sense, that could be a variable. But then, if you have the plane, or if you have the grid, right, of the neighborhoods, and you have the dots, right? Some of these people are going to be female, some of them are going to be male, and so that's what's going to lead to the socio-demographic composition. Just that some of these are male, some of these are female. So in a way, it's like as if you think of it just like as if all of this represented a quote-unquote reality. Like if you had a data set and you actually looked at the people within your sample, some of these people are male, some of these people are female, that's what's represented here.
But so are you modeling a coefficient then, that this proportion of people are male versus female? I mean,
no, what you're modeling is, so how can I explain this? So for example, no, so for example, for the male or female, you know, the census tells me that 50% of people within New York are female, okay? So I set up my model so that 50% of these dots are female.
So it's like a rule that you're setting up based on the, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
a rule based on the data.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a rule based on the data, and it's also probabilities. So the probability that, you know, you have a certain probability of being a victim, and that probability is based on a regression model or on rules that you set up for your data. So sometimes regressions do come into play, but how it's all implemented is through rules and probabilities.
So each box there has an equation that says, here's how you get the number in that box, or the state of that box. That's an equation based where the dependent variables are all the other boxes?
Each box is made up of multiple equations. And so, for example, how can I say this? So, you know, for example, the census will tell you that 50% are female, 50% are male. The average income is whatever it is, right? 50,000, whatever it is, right? And so, based on that, I put my agents in the grid, and I give them a certain characteristic. I determine who's male and female, who has an income of X or Y characteristic. That's going to determine, for example, the racial ethnic composition and the income in the neighborhood, right? Then data
so that's
from...
like your starting state.
Yeah, exactly. The data from New York is going to tell me that X% of people drink, X% of, you know, females aged 50 of X income drink. So I, you know, in this grid, I have, you know, well, whoever in this grid is, you know, 50 years old and female, and whatever the income is going to the data tells me that that person has a high probability of being a light drinker, so that person is going to be a light drinker, right? And so that it matches, so that at the end of the day, I have 30% of light drinkers who are 50-year-old female and have a certain income, because that's what the data show me. Okay? So that's your baseline state. But then, how people move and change over time is based on transition probabilities, which are parameterized by data by regression equations. Does that clarify it? I'm going to go through it, so you'll actually be able to see how all of this happens. So maybe we can go through it, and if still not clear, you can ask more questions. Yes?
You have to build this conceptual framework as complex as it is from the beginning and then go to collect data, or you improve it over time?
No, you improve it over time. Yeah, definitely. Like, for example, when we started out, we didn't have the networks at all. We didn't have the movement, and we didn't have the alcohol outlets. So you could simplify, you could get to the bare bones of your model, depending on what your question is. And that's why I said at the beginning, you want to keep it as simple as possible, right? So you want to say, okay, my question of interest is, what the effect of drinking on violence. What are the bare bones of this that I have to keep in order for a logical model to arise, right? And so then you do that. And then if you want to ask more questions, you can start adding, like we started asking a lot of questions about neighborhoods without accounting for networks because it was just too much at the beginning. And then we said, okay, well, this is probably unrealistic because people's networks matter, and so then we added in the networks. And then we said, well, people, they can't just stay in one neighborhood forever, which is what our first models showed us. In our first models, we didn't allow people to move. That's unrealistic, so then we added the movement. But each piece that you add takes a lot of work, so that's why you want to do it in layers. Okay, so this model was calibrated by a lot of data, so more than 26 data sources and 30 studies. This is a list of some of the studies that we used to calibrate this model. So just as an example of what I said before, that you want to have as much data as you can to build a model. If your aim is to answer a question about a particular population, you want to have as much data as possible to calibrate the model well. Okay, so one of the first things that you want to do when you're setting up an agent-based model is think about what are the central dynamics that you're interested in reproducing in your model. What are the central dynamics that really led you to choose your agent-based model? So in this case, these are the central dynamics in our model. So we hypothesized that exposure to risky drinking contexts, that is, what I mean by risky drinking context is, for example, bars where there are a lot of heavy drinkers, and exposure to violence is going to be determined by where you live, processes of assortative drinking, that is that like drinks with like, heavy drinkers drink with heavy drinkers, light drinkers drink with light drinkers, and the influence of social networks and social norms. That is that the fact that your friends drink is going to increase your probability of drinking. So these three dynamics are going to lead to your exposure to risky drinking contexts and violence, your exposure to, for example, bars with a lot of heavy drinkers, your exposure to places where there are a lot of people with a high probability of being violent is going to lead to your individual risk of being a heavy drinker, your individual risk of being victimized, and then your own experiences with drinking and victimization are going to lead you to move or not move across neighborhoods, and then that movement is going to, again, expose you to different types of drinking contexts and violence. Okay? So, again, what I talked about before about these processes of assortative selection of contexts, that was one thing we wanted to account for, that these models allowed us to account for, right? Selection into neighborhoods, selection into drinking contexts. And then this circular process of exposure to drinking contexts leading to drinking and violence, leading you to move, again, affecting exposure to drinking context. So this circular process. So that's one thing you want to think about as the first step, right? A, I have a question of interest. B, what are the central dynamics that I want to address in this model? Then these are then thinking about, well, what are the central components of the model? So the central components for us were the neighborhoods, because we wanted to look at the influence of the residential context on drinking and violence, the social networks, the alcohol outlets, and the police officers, right? So, okay, I have my questions, I have my dynamics of interest. what are the central key components in my model that I want to make sure I have in the model, and why? What exactly is the purpose of having each of these elements of my model? So that's just, yes?
Sorry if this is a distraction. I was just
No,
curious.
no.
What were the alternative policing strategies? I
What?
was just very curious what the alternative policing strategies were.
Oh, yeah. So with that, we were interested in looking at hotspots policing. So what would be the effect of moving? So if we have, we have data on the allocation of police in New York according to the actual neighborhoods where they're placed. So what if we relocated them and just focused them on the most violent neighborhoods? What would be the effect of that on violence?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we have our question. We've identified the dynamics of interest, right? The feedback processes, the assortative selection processes, the networks, whatever it is you're interested in, right? We've identified the central components of the model. So then what do we do, right? We actually go and set up our model. So how do we set up our model? So the first thing we do is we initialize the model. So what does that mean? We set up the baseline model, right? Before we start changing anything, before we allow agents to move across time, we have to set up the model, right? Okay, so what does that mean? In this case, it meant creating the agent population, creating the neighborhoods, assigning agents to a location within the neighborhood, assigning them a drinking and violence status, assigning initial neighborhood characteristics, assigning locations of alcohol outlets, and creating the network. So I'm going to go through each of these. Hopefully this will help you understand better what we were talking about before about the difference between variables and the setup of these models. Okay, so in this case, we wanted to create a population that represented 5% of the New York City population. That means we had about 260,000 agents in our model. And these agents have the actual characteristics that reflect the New York City population according to the Census 2000. So what does that mean? It means that if you look at these characteristics, sex, race, age, marital status, education, and income, these are the characteristics that the census tells us the New York City population has. And on the second column are the characteristics of our agents. Okay? So we've defined, we have 260,000 agents. We've given them demographic characteristics so that they reflect the demographic characteristics of the New York City population. And we've been able to do that well because you can see that they're actually quite similar to the actual census data on the New York City population. So, yeah.
When you have real people, all these things are multivariate, right?
Yeah.
So how do you generate it? What is described is individual characteristics, not the joint distribution of characteristics. So how do we assign them to individual people?
So because we can actually use the census data to do that. So the census,
you use the multivariate?
Yes, exactly. So that's one very nice thing about using actual data, that you can create these conditional probabilities that, say like how many are going to be males of age 50.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
What's the reason for not perfect match? Or some of the, like you have the exact number that you want to achieve. There were some of them like, there was 1% off or 0.5% off.
I think part of it is randomness. So, yeah, I think that's a lot of it. And it may be that, we're only looking at certain characteristics of the census. So because it's a simplification of those characteristics of the census, we're not getting exact matches as if we had looked at more characteristics of the census.
So it's not like that when you set it up, you just run the cross-stratification for every possible covariate combination and say, oh, there are 23 people like this, and 170 people like this, and 23,000 people like that. You have some probabilistic process.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Why only 5% of the population when you could theoretically do all of New York?
Yeah, you could, because it would take days to run. And given our computing capacity, we just couldn't do that. But yes. And there are, in fact, models. So, for example, there's a synthetic population that is set up by RTI that has the exact number of people in the exact location of the exact demographic makeup for multiple cities in the U.S. that you could use. That would arguably be better. Yeah.
So for the sampling, are you using like the microdata then to aggregate, or are you actually just using like the summary file to get percentages for 5% of the? I mean, how is the sampling actually done to get those possibilities?
I think we're using the microdata.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Why was the marital status was way off between the two?
the marital status.
Married 44% versus 25.
Oh, yeah.
I think the second column doesn't
It's
have
like a typo.
Yeah, must be a typo.
It should be
Probably
45.
45.5.
Yeah, I think that is a typo actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it should add up to 100, right?
Yeah, that's a typo.
Nice.
Okay, so we have the agents and we give them a certain characteristics. So in this case, we give them characteristics according to just a small number of New York City demographics. Then we say, okay, we want to place these agents somewhere, right? In this case, we're placing them in a grid of neighborhoods. So we place them in 59 community districts, so that community districts is one way to designate neighborhoods in New York City. And we created a grid that actually approximated the sizes and the locations of New York neighborhoods. So there are many different types of topologies that you can use to set up in the environment in agent-based models. One way is what's called the cellular automata, which is the way of which our example is one illustration. But that's just one way that you could do it. You could also, for example, do a network topology, so just have agents connected to each other, for example, through social links. You could have multidimensional space. You could completely approximate the city according to the actual topology of the city using GIS, which is, for example, what the synthetic populations created by RTI do. Or you could have an aspatial setup. So there are multiple ways, depending on what your question is, that you can actually set up the environment. The way that we did it is, this is a map of New York City community districts. Different colors represent different boroughs within New York. And so what we did is we created a grid that is another way of representing a cellular automata method. And so the grid represents different New York City community districts. And so if you look at the colors actually represent the different New York boroughs. And all of these, the location and the size of each of these rectangles actually approximates the size and the location of actual New York neighborhoods. So this is a summary of the grid. And then after we created this grid, what we wanted to do is we wanted to assign agents to neighborhoods. So we had the grid, we had the agent, right? And I said before, agents had certain demographic characteristics. We assigned agents to a certain rectangle within the grid based on the data that we had about their sex, their race, their age, and their income. And then within the neighborhood, they were just in a random location within the neighborhood. In that way, we were able to create a simulation of New York neighborhoods that actually represented the actual spatial location of people in New York City according to race, according to income, age, marital status, etc. Does that make sense?
Except that that's not based on census data, right?
It's based, yes, it's based on what the census data tells us about where people live, according to the census tract, and then converting the census tract back to the community district.
But that was the census wasn't part of the initial process of getting the agents, right?
No, the census was. So because we used the census data to give us the characteristics, the demographic characteristics of New York people, right? So we said 5% of people, how many are married, how many are
right. But what about where they live?
Right, and so the census can actually tell us where people live because it gives us census tracts and it gives us information about the distribution of neighborhoods according to income, etc. So we could use that to predict, how many older people lived in Harlem versus. And so then once we did that, once we created the grid of neighborhoods, we placed agents within these neighborhoods according to what the census told us about where people live. We wanted to make sure that we had calibrated this well, right? So you notice that at every step of the process, we're stopping to look at how what we've done compares to actual data, right? So here's an example of certain neighborhoods in New York and the demographic composition of the neighborhoods according to what the census tells us and according to what the agent-based model tells us. And so that way we're able to see that we've been able to fairly well replicate what the census tells us about the demographic composition of actual neighborhoods within New York City. Yeah?
So why didn't you just use GIS, given that you have the properties of the spatial units from the census already?
Because at the time we didn't have the technology to be able to do that. Yeah. As the next step in our modeling process, we are going to get the synthetic data to be able to use GIS. Yeah. Okay, so once we set up our grid of neighborhoods, we placed agents within these neighborhoods using census data. We said, okay, these are well-calibrated models. We've been able to replicate the population of New York. Yeah. Then what else did we do? Then we assigned each agent an initial substance use status. So agents were able to be non-drinkers, light to moderate drinkers, or heavy drinkers. So heavy drinkers, it means 5 or more drinks per day, or more than 21 drinks per week for men, 4 or more for women, or more than 14 drinks per week for women. And so each agent was assigned the probability of being a light drinker, a moderate drinker, a light drinker, a moderate drinker, a heavy drinker. And we used data to calibrate that. So because we had a sample of the New York City population, we had a cohort study of New York residents that included a representative sample of the New York population. And so we used that to predict the probability that different agents would be non, light, or heavy drinker. So what do I mean by that? This is a regression model. Again, so remember, I just told you, right, that we set up the baseline characteristics of the population. But this is where variables come in, right? You want to assign every agent a probability of being a light drinker, for example, right? How did we do that? We used regression models to do that, based on actual data from a cohort study. So we had this cohort study. Actually, this is using national data, but we did it actually both ways, with the cohort study of New York and with national data. And so what we do is we'd say, okay, according to this data, what's the probability of somebody being a light drinker given their sex, their age, their race, marital status, education, and income? And so then we have an actual probability of being a light drinker for every agent within the model. And the same for heavy drinkers. Yeah.
So you're in the beginning of the populating the status quo or initial group is based on 4 or 5 demographic characteristics that are in a census model. How about important variables that can predict some of the like the outcomes that you're interested in? Like, for example, if someone in the family is also a drinker,
yeah,
how would that fit here? Or are you capturing it somewhere else?
We're not capturing it. So you could add it in. Yeah. So there are many things that one could think about that could influence drinking that we didn't capture here, but that you could add in. So family history would be one of them. And if you had the data to do it, you could add that in, for example, as another predictor here, to be able to predict the probability that somebody would be a drinker, a heavy drinker, or a light drinker. But then I think you'd have to have family members within your model in order to be able to allow that to emerge within the agents. Because different agents would have to have Right. Different agents would have to have a certain family history in order for you to be able to then predict the probability for somebody with X family history and Y demographic characteristics. So you'd have to add that to your whole model. But yes, you could do that.
So you're modeling your separately the probability of being no drinker, light drinker, moderate, and heavy drinker. Why not model the number of drinks?
Because we wanted to look at changes between states. Because we wanted to see what led somebody to become a heavy drinker, and we were particularly interested in that. But you could do number
And
of
the
drinks.
way you would decide if the person was a heavy drinker is which probability was the highest?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So conceptually, could you do the alternative approach of saying that I'm modeling transition between I'm modeling changes in the continuous variable, and then just categorize and pose the category?
Yeah.
Okay.
You could.
So you could do either one. It's just
Yes.
Right.
Okay. This is just what we chose to do, but you could definitely do either one.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
If there were an association between neighborhood and drinking net of these factors, did the procedure you follow allow you to get that or not?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So for every one of the assumptions that we made with this model is that 5% of your probability of being a drinker, for every drinking state and for every violent state, 5% of your probability would be defined by your neighborhood. And so all of the, so basically what we ended up with was a series of regression equations in which we allowed for, imagine, 95% of the probability to be defined by these individual characteristics and 5% by another regression equation based on the neighborhood characteristics. That's an assumption that we made based on the literature about neighborhood influences, but you could make many different assumptions about that.
So, but you had some data on that,
Yeah.
and that went into the initial assignment.
Yeah.
So there is going to be some patterning over and above what you see from the demographics.
Yes.
And that's one of the things you could alter if you didn't.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things we varied to see how our assumption about the proportion of effect done due to the neighborhood, what effect that assumption has on our results, which I'm going to show for another study, which is related later on.
Just one
Okay.
more question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So something that's bothering me is we could throw in a bunch of more covariates in the regression model to predict the drinking patterns.
Yeah.
Right? At one point, would it become circular because we're also some of those very same domains or conditions are in the model too? So how they're going to interact with each other? If we have an estimate about, you're basically projecting the estimate for drinking, for example, with the family history or network status.
Yeah.
And then the same variable is in the model too at the same time in the bigger model. So how do they interact? Which is, I'm not sure if I'm asking the question.
Right, so that's why for some characteristics you allow it to emerge from the model. So for example, for the network stuff, you wouldn't specify within this regression model that there's a peer effect, but you would connect agents to each other. So first you would predict the probability of the person being a light drinker, a heavy drinker, etc., based on these characteristics. Then after that, as I'm going to show, you would add in the network effect. And so then you would add in how people are connected to each other. And then the probability would change depending on that regression equation based on those individual characteristics. It would change based on where they're located within the space. And it would change based on who their friends are at time X. So that way you can build it all up in different pieces, and it's not circular. Okay, so I just showed you a basic regression equation that we use to calculate the probabilities of the drinking status for agents, right? And so then what we want to do again is calibrate back, right? We want to compare back to actual New York data. How have we been able to reproduce New York data about drinking status? And so here it is the data based on New York data, and here it is based on the agent-based model. And this is non-drinker, light, moderate, and heavy overall, the whole sample, and then by racial ethnic group. And so we've been able to fairly well, with some differences, replicate the distribution of drinking status in New York by racial ethnic group. Then we want to go further. We can say, okay, well, our regression equation was based on a certain number of covariates, right? So how have we been able to replicate well the distribution of light, moderate drinkers according to all of these characteristics that we predicted from, right? And so we compare what the New York data tell us compared to what our model tells us about the distribution of light to moderate drinkers by age, race, education, etc. Have we been able to calibrate the model well in terms of the basic characteristics of light drinkers? Fairly well. It's the estimates, the actual data from New York lies within the confidence interval for our model results. Okay, we're fairly confident we've been able to replicate the demographic characteristics of light moderate drinkers in New York. And then we do the same for the heavy drinkers. Okay, so we've set up, right now, I've told you, we've set up the agents, we've set up the grid of neighborhoods, we've set up their drinking status, which we used regression models to predict. Then we have the agents, we have where they live, but the neighborhoods don't yet have any characteristics. Okay? But now what we want to do as the next step, as the fifth step, is to assign the initial neighborhood characteristics. So some of these characteristics arise from the agents in the model, right? I've told you I've given these agents certain characteristics. I've dropped them down in this grid, right? I've dropped them down in the grid according to what the census tells us about who lives where. So then you can see that certain characteristics are going to emerge from that by neighborhood, right? You're going to have a median income by neighborhood. You're going to have a percent black by neighborhood. You're going to have an average drinking by neighborhood, etc. Then you can also assign other characteristics to the neighborhoods based on external sources. That is, or sources separate from the agents you've dropped down into the grid. And so we are assigning from external sources the distribution of police officers based on New York City Police Department data on where police officers are located in New York. And then we've assigned a distribution of alcohol outlets based on data. So location of alcohol outlets, to give you an example. So how would we do that? So we have data from the New York State Liquor Authority on the number of on and off-premise retail liquor licenses in each community district. What does that mean? On-premise means bars and restaurants. Off-premise means liquor stores. And so we have all the data about how, neighborhood Harlem, whatever it is, a certain neighborhood, how many bars does it have, okay? And so we can actually give each neighborhood a number of outlets according to what the data actually tell us about the number of outlets in each neighborhood. And we're randomly assigning outlets to cells within neighborhoods. So what does that mean? This is an illustration. Again, if we go back to the grid of the New York City neighborhoods that we created for our model, the dots represent outlets, white dots represent on-premise outlets, so restaurants and bars, black dots represent liquor stores. Okay? So now, yes?
So do you randomly assign because you don't have the actual locations? Or, like, if you had a data set that had actual...
So you could. We do have the actual locations. I don't think we actually did have the actual locations. We just had the community district for them. But you could, if you had the actual locations, like if you had the X and Y coordinates, and you had a GIS representation of this model, which again we didn't have, you could do that. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so now we have agents. They have certain behaviors. They have certain demographic characteristics. They live in neighborhoods with certain characteristics themselves. Okay, so you can see we've gone through a multi-step process to set this up. The same way that you could set up a model for the agents with the characteristics of your interest and the environment of your interest. Then another thing that we did is we connected agents to each other. So this is a choice you can make. You don't have to make this choice if you don't want to, but one of the aspects of interest for us was the fact that how much you drink might depend on who your friends are, how violent you are might depend on who your friends are, and so we connected agents to each other. And so what we did is we had data from the General Social Survey, which is this national survey about the average number of ties people have. So you can ask, well, how does that translate to New York, right? That would be a really good question to ask. And the answer is, we don't know. That's an assumption we're making, right? Like with all of this, you can see how we're making a lot of assumptions as I go along, right? But it's the data that we have, and so we have to make certain assumptions, which then we can test, right? But so we're giving each agent a number of friends, and then we're matching the agents to each other based on a certain set of characteristics. So the average number of links was 3, and friends were matched to each other based on age, sex, race, education, drinking status, and geographical proximity. So again, because we really cared about this issue of like goes with like, right? That friends are not randomly assigned to you. You are friends with people who are like you. So we wanted to, the probability of this person being friends with another person depended on their similarity in demographic characteristics in drinking and how close they were to each other within the grid. You could make a lot of different assumptions about the actual the drivers of people being friends. You can make assumptions about the structure of the network. These were some simplifying assumptions that we made. And so in our model, what we were interested in was spatial proximity, right? People being close to each other. Social proximity, people being similar in demographics and in behavior. And collectives in terms of people, again, being close to each other defined by neighborhoods. Okay, so far, any questions so far? Okay, so...
One question. Did you say we assign networks based on the geographical location?
Yes.
But in all the process you came far away, wasn't any real geographical spatial association with data in the new model?
So what I mean by that is that where they were on the grid, right? So I said that we set up a grid of neighborhoods, right? We set up a grid like that represented New York neighborhoods that reflected the actual size and location of New York neighborhoods, and we dropped agents within the grid according to what the census tells us about who lives where. So then the probability of agents being friends with each other depended on where they were in the grid. So this agent who lived here, for example, imagine that there were 10 agents living in this square, okay? The probability of an agent here having a friend, they would have a much higher probability of being friends with other agents who are in this square or in this square rather than agents being in this square. That's all it means.
Assuming that is the real living place for that person, what is the chance of being connection with other people? That is the assumption.
Right, exactly.
It's not the real place.
It's what the census tells us about how likely, right? The census tells us that, for example, this, according to the census, according to real data, is likely to be a low-income neighborhood. Just say. I don't know what neighborhood this is supposed to represent, but imagine this is a low-income neighborhood with a low-income older neighborhood with more males and more Hispanics. Okay? The census actually tells us that. So this grid reflects that level of reality. Now, the actual location of people within the neighborhood, it doesn't reflect. And then how the probability that people will be friends with each other will depend partly on where they're located within the grid. And that's going to reflect what the census tells us about the demographic distribution of people in New York. Does that make sense? Okay, so so we've set up this model to have certain characteristics. We've set up the agents to live in certain neighborhoods, to be connected to each other, to have certain behaviors, to have probability of having certain behaviors. We're reasonably confident that we've replicated the status of things in New York according to the data that we have, the census data, the neighborhood data, the cohort data. So now we can go on and actually allow these agents to change over time. Okay? So we've passed the initialization piece of the model, and now we go into the actual steps of the model. And these are the steps that were involved in our model. So I'm going to go through them. So the first thing is that we allowed agents to age and to die and to be reborn. Again, another assumption. Agents, they die and they are reborn as 18-year-olds. So they're reborn as adults, right? That's a big assumption. Again, right? We don't have children in our model because that would be a whole other layer of complexity that we could not get into at this time. But again, think about, right? At every step of the model, we're making a lot of assumptions, and you have to be very careful about thinking in the assumptions that you're making, what consequences could those assumptions have.
So they're reborn with only the age different, everything else the way it was before?
Right. They're reborn as 18-year-old, right, with
but
the same location.
Gender,
right.
the same.
Yeah. So it's like a continuously renewing system. Yeah. So they age 1 year at each time step. They die according to all-cause mortality rates and according to homicide in particular, and then they're reborn.
Everything the same.
Okay. So again, thinking about what assumptions we're making at every step of the way here. How do we define whether they die? We use actual data on mortality from the medical examiner in New York City that tells us about the mortality rate by certain demographic characteristics. And so we define who's going to die and at what rate, depending on real data from New York. And so we can see here we're comparing the mortality rate according to New York City Department of Health data for by sex, race, and age, and we compare that to the rates in the first year of the agent-based model and after 30 years. So the question is, have we been able to replicate the distribution of mortality in New York City as of the first year, and how much does it change over time? And so we can see that according to this model, we've been able to fairly well replicate the distribution of mortality by sex, race, and age in New York. Then agents are able to move across neighborhoods. Yes?
If everyone is basically reborns, the baseline is kind of constant regardless of the age of the cohort. How over time is going to, why did it change that much, the mortality in 30 years?
Because I think it's because we've allowed for other things to be added to the model beyond just the
those
demographic.
characteristics.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, you match the original population and you match the death rate, but you haven't matched the birth rate. So presumably over time that'll cause
also. Right. Right. So we're not allowing people.
Dependent on those characters that you were showing here.
What?
It wasn't just based on those characters in the, that you showed.
Yeah.
It was also
and also by what he was saying about the fact that we're just allowing people to die and be reborn, right, as adults, so we're not accounting for the actual birth rate in the New York population.
Okay.
Or people moving in and out of New York City.
Also, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's another big assumption that we're making. We're assuming that people they move across within New York, but they don't move out of New York and they don't move into New York. So it's like as if we had closed New York, right? So all of those things are going to affect the death rate. So that's going to affect the evolution of the death rate over 30 years. So another thing that we did is, so we allowed agents to move, to be born, to die, to age, and then we allowed them to move. So this is something that gave us a huge headache. We spent a ton of time on this. So this was not a piece of our initial model, but we did think it was an important driver of the dynamics of violence. So each agent actually had a probability of moving at each step of the model based on how long they had lived in that neighborhood, the income, how long they had lived as we ran the model, right? Their income, whether they had been victimized before, whether they had perpetrated violence in the past year. This was all based on Detroit data. Because, why was it based on Detroit data? Because we didn't have any data on predictors of movement for New York. So we had to use data from the only place where we had data on predictors of movement, which was a Detroit neighborhood study. So we allowed agents to select a new neighborhood based on their demographics, using the same process that we had used to initially assign people to neighborhoods in the initial step of the model, right? So people were able to move because of changes in their behavior, because of their demographics, but where they moved depended on their demographics. So this allowed for the composition of the neighborhoods not to change substantially over time. And then we calibrated each of these pieces, again, with data from the census, with data from this Detroit study, but also with data from the panel study of income dynamics, which is this national panel study on people's income and on people's movement over time. So hopefully being able to better calibrate the model, a model of New York based on data from another city. Yes?
So in this case, I'm just wondering and thinking about using Detroit data versus ACS data, which does have, you can get movement, you just can't get any of the predictors.
That's the problem, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, but so how do you balance that? Because it's not New York data. You can get New York data, it's just much less specific. So maybe that's just an abstract question, but.
Yeah, so right, so we could predict in New York based on demographic characteristics, but then, and so we could have made the decision just to do that. But because we were interested in these feedback processes of how violence could change people's location, we decided to add the Detroit data for that.
And Detroit has atypical rates of violence, so how do you adjust for that? You don't.
So a lot of times what we do is we use, for example, a composite regression where we use data, for example, from New York to predict movement based on demographics, and so to predict chosen location based on demographics, but then we added the missing pieces from, the Detroit data like victimization or perpetration, and then we see to what extent they compare to what we see in New York. And to what extent they compare to what we see nationwide. And then sometimes we have to adjust the parameters or the effects that we're assuming in our model to match what we see in the data. So it's not an ideal assumption in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. So for example, the ACS, the census told us that the percent who had moved between 2005 and 2009 was 11%. That was fairly closely matched by our model. Also, the panel study on income dynamics work, seminal work done by Pat Sharkey on transitions between neighborhoods, told us that the percent of people who moved, like for example, from low income to low income neighborhoods, low to high to high, etc., were these here in this first column, and so we were able to moderately well reflect the actual transition probabilities across income levels, across neighborhoods that we see nationwide with our model of movement. Right? So again, this is another example of where we're making a set of assumptions about A, the drivers of movement, B, the data sources for that movement, and C, we're comparing what we get from the calculations that we've made to actual data and seeing how well have we actually reflected reality given our assumptions, and are we willing to live with the results that we're getting here. And so, and then we can vary the assumptions about neighborhood movement in later sensitivity analyses to see how much our assumptions are affecting our findings. So just to give you an idea, I'm not going to, in the interest of time, because we have half an hour left, I'm not going to get into the code, but this is just, just to give you an example of what code looks like to set up these models.
And what language is this?
This is with Java. We're using Repass Symphony. And actually, if you are interested in looking at more code, I can give you citations for some of our papers where in our appendices we have commented code for everything. Okay, so then after we've allowed agents to age, allowed agents to move, we are also allowing them to change drinking status. So here, we're allowing agents to change, so like in Markov chains, we're allowing agents to change from non-drinker to light moderate to non-heavy, or continue light moderate, etc. These probabilities are based on regression models, based on all of the characteristics that you see there. So where they live, their sociodemographic characteristics, their interaction with other agents, and their level of violence.
Heavy drinkers can't just stop, and light drinkers can't become heavy. I mean, non-drinkers can't become heavy.
Light drinkers can't become heavy. That's right.
And heavy can't stop.
Yeah, right. So it's just a first-order Markov model. That's right. Yeah.
I see. But then the very next time they.
Yeah, they could exactly. Yeah, but they can only change to one step. Yeah. Okay, so one of the dynamics that I told you about that we cared about was this process of circular relationship between drinking status and selection of an outlet. And so that's going to change people's likelihood of changing from light to heavy, non to light, etc. So I just wanted to illustrate some of these dynamics here. So we established that drinking status determined the selection of the preferred alcohol outlet. Selection of preferred alcohol outlet influenced drinking status. How does that happen in our model? So this is just a snapshot showing you a grid where you have agents. You have one agent who's a heavy drinker in the white dot, and you have on-premise outlets in the yellow dot, and an off-premise outlet in the blue dot. And these numbers indicate the proportion of heavy drinkers at the outlet. So as the model runs, the drinker is going to look for an outlet with the highest proportion of other drinkers who are like them. So the heavy drinker is going to look for the outlet that's closest to him, that has the highest proportion of heavy drinkers. So the initial outlet that they're going to choose is this outlet here. So that's the outlet with the highest proportion of heavy drinkers. That's closest to the heavy drinker. And then in the next outlet that they would choose is this other outlet, which is further away, but also has a high proportion of heavy drinkers. So in the first instance, they would choose this one because it's closest, highest proportion of heavy drinkers. But then in the next step, they would choose the other outlet that actually has a higher proportion of heavy drinkers. So that's how, operationally speaking, we operationalize this vague idea about people selecting into context, right? With these behavioral rules that we make up based on real data about where people choose to congregate. So we're saying heavy drinkers are choosing to congregate in outlets with other heavy drinkers. Light drinkers are choosing to congregate in outlets with other light drinkers. So agents look for an outlet with more drinkers like them, and then the higher proportion of heavy drinkers at that outlet is going to increase the agent's probability of staying or becoming a heavy drinker. Okay? Does that make sense? So you can see that it's a combination, but that's why I said it's a combination of parameters from regression models and behavioral rules, right? I'm setting up this set of agents within a grid. I'm giving them certain probabilities based on data. I'm giving them certain behavioral rules that are going to govern their behaviors, but also those behaviors are, and the transitions between states are determined by these regression equations.
Your Markov model for drinking, your probabilities don't depend on what you've done in the past, only your current state?
No, so it depends, right, so it depends on, all of those transitions depend on all of these characteristics which are in prior runs. So how violent they were, their history of violence, their history of smoking, their history of where they lived, their friends, all of that was from prior.
But just one step.
But not, I mean, someone who's been a heavy drinker for 5 years and then becomes a light drinker is way more likely to go back to being a heavy drinker than someone who was only a heavy drinker for 1 year or one iteration.
Right, so it would just be from the prior step. Right, yeah.
One step.
It would be from the prior step, but it would also be from their own characteristics, which we're giving them based on the regression model, which can give you a longer history. If that makes sense. So you can change status based on the prior step, but it's also determined by these individual characteristics you've assigned based on a regression model. So it could be, you can account for longer history in that way. And so then we go back, we compare what the transition probabilities are from each status according to actual New York data to the transition probabilities that we've been able to replicate in our model, and we see that we've been able to fairly well replicate, again, the transition probabilities for drinking in our model. And then we look at the drinking, we can look at the drinking trajectories over time for non-drinkers. Light, moderate, and heavy drinkers. Heavy drinkers are the red at the bottom, and we can look at them by race. Okay? Yeah.
Just so I'm sure I understand. So if I am a light drinker and I can't find a location to drink with a lot of light drinkers super close to me, the closest place with a reasonable number of light drinkers also has a whole lot of heavy drinkers, I'm more likely to become a heavy drinker. Is that what this model imposes?
Yes.
Okay, so if you eliminate light drinking venues for me, and okay. Got it.
Yeah, and then you're only going to go to heavy drinking venues, and then that's going to determine that you're going to become a heavy drinker yourself.
Okay,
yes,
that's
exactly. Okay, so the same way that we're establishing drinking transitions, we can establish probabilities of violence, so probabilities of being victimized, non-fatally, that is, for example, you're stabbed but you didn't die. Probabilities of fatal victimization, that's you were shot and you died. Probability of perpetrating violence, that is you shot somebody, you stabbed them, you hit them, whatever it was you chose to do. Again, all of these probabilities are determined by a series of regression models and behavioral rules. So according to your own history of these characteristics, so prior violence, drinking, neighborhood characteristics, and who you're friends with. And then, so each agent has a probability of being a victim, a probability of being a perpetrator. The victim and the perpetrator have to come into close contact with each other. If they come into close contact and there's no police present, and I will show you how that happens, a violent act happens. Some of them die from homicide. If the victim or the perpetrator were drinking, it's an alcohol-related act of violence. Okay? That's in a nutshell, but I'm going to show you how it works. So here is a snapshot of agents within our model. The red dots represent the potential victims. The blue dots represent the potential perpetrators. The green dots, the police. And the yellow square is the alcohol outlets. Okay? You with me so far?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of fun.
Okay. So what happens is, again, based on some assumptions, based on what we know about the spatial dynamics of violence, we've set up a rule where, as the model runs, a potential perpetrator, that is an agent with a high probability of being a perpetrator, looks within a 10-cell radius for any potential victims, okay? So here's one potential perpetrator. There are many victims here, potential victims, right? So it looks for potential victims. The violence can be prevented if there's a police officer within a 5-cell radius of the potential victim. So you can see here, this victim has no police officer within the 5-cell radius. This one doesn't, this one doesn't, this one doesn't. This one is lucky, and there's a police officer there. Okay? So, based on that, all of these 4 victims were attacked. There was no police officer. This one was not attacked because there was a police officer. Okay, that's the spatial dynamics of violence. That accounts for how victims and perpetrators need to come into contact with each other in order for a violent act to happen. And how we account for how we make up those rules is based on what we know about the radius of action of police officers, and what we know about the spatial dynamics of violence. And we can vary those assumptions and see how much our results change based on varying those assumptions. Yes?
Yeah, that was going to be my question, is where did the 10 and 5 numbers come from?
Yeah.
The radius.
Yeah, so for example, for the 5, it's based on data from police about what their radius of action is. And the same with there's some studies about the situational determinants of violence that we use to determine the radius for the victim and perpetrator interaction. Yes?
Do you mind just going back one slide? And then I had a question about, are victims, sorry, back to the flow chart. Are victims influenced by alcohol, or they can be, they don't have to be?
Are victims influenced by alcohol? Yes. Yes.
Always?
Yes. Well, so by a certain probability. So it's a probabilistic equation. So your drinking level, your risk of being a victim, or the level, your probability of being a victim is going to be partly determined by whether you are a heavy drinker, or a light drinker, or a non-drinker.
So all those gray dots, can you clarify who the gray people are then?
So the gray people are people who do not have, or agents who do not have a high probability of being a victim.
Okay.
So because of all of the different characteristics that determine that probability, including the history of drinking, they do not have a high enough probability to be classified as a potential victim.
As we know, sometimes being a victim is being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's partly what this is trying to show, yes. Okay, and so then, again, we compare what the distribution of victimization and perpetration is, compared to published estimates, unpublished estimates based on data we have. And so these are all data about New York or national data on the distribution of victimization and perpetration and past year, and then we compare it to our model, and we see that we're able to replicate data on annual victimization and perpetration and also lifetime rates. And then we look at violent victimization over time by race. Again, we've been able to replicate higher rates of victimization for blacks, and we're also able to replicate the distribution of perpetration over time. And then also we compare not only non-fatal victimization, but we look at rates of homicide according to New York medical examiner data, both for total homicide and alcohol-related homicide. And we compare data from the medical examiner's office to data from our model, and see whether we've been able to replicate actual homicide rates. Yes?
How do you get confidence intervals for this if there were so many assumptions that kind of went into each step?
Yeah, so they're not really like confidence intervals. It's more that we run the model, for example, 1,000 times, and so the confidence interval is the bounds from the runs after discarding a burden period.
So the confidence interval doesn't take into account uncertainty in the mechanisms that, or like in the rules that you put in, right?
It accounts for randomness.
Right.
We account for a component of randomness within the model, but it doesn't account for
if the rules like wrong. or if you're not sure what the rule is.
Yes.
Or whatever.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And so one of the areas that we want to look at for future work is how to account for those other aspects of uncertainty, so to make this more like a confidence interval. You could say about rule wrongness, but really the other thing is measurement error, for example. So a lot of these models don't account for the role of measurement error in uncertainty, and so that's one area that we're trying to work on now. Okay, and finally, we give each agent a beverage preference. I'm going to go over this very quickly because we have 15 minutes left. But every agent who drinks is able to have a preference for a type of drink. And again, this is based on a regression model, based on real data. We gave each person a probability of preferring beer, wine, or liquor, okay, based on their demographic characteristics. Again, because we're interested in alcohol use, we want to make this as realistic as possible, and what drink you prefer will affect how the alcohol tax, for example, affects you. Okay, so now we've set up our model, okay? So we've set up this model, we have agents, they live in a certain neighborhood, they're able to drink, they're able to be victimized, they're able to attack others, they have friends, and then we've said, okay, we've compared it to actual data, we're fairly confident that this is a good model in the sense that it's well calibrated against real data. We've been able to replicate the features of people within New York. Then what do we do next? Okay, after we've done all of that, which could take a fairly long amount of time, and again, do you remember what I said about the cycle of modeling? We've gone through many, many different cycles, right? For each step, we've gone through a cycle of modeling and calibration and going back for each of those many times to be able to get a calibrated model. Then what do? Okay, then we can actually change things in the models and do different simulations. And so in this case, we did 3 different kinds of simulations. We did beverage taxes, so universal or beer tax. And how did we do taxes? Well, this was based on the empirical literature. So we had data from the literature about the effect that different types of beverage taxes have on drinking behaviors. And so that influenced drinking and drinking transitions, which then indirectly influenced violence. Okay? There's a lot of data on the effect of beverage taxes on drinking in the US and abroad that we could use to calibrate that. Alcohol outlets, we close them at earlier hours. Again, based on the literature, what the literature tells us about the effect of early closing time on violent assault. And we also closed outlets entirely. We tried closing outlets randomly across the whole city, tried closing outlets only in high violence neighborhoods. And again, using real data about what studies have shown about the effect of closing outlets on drinking and on violence.
Can you, I know we're a little bit low on time, but can you comment a little bit more on what that literature is? And this is not my area, but from what I've heard about this, that it's very controversial what this literature suggests about effects on alcohol intake. It just seems like a tricky part of the exercise, right? To assume that a tax, for example, would decrease alcohol use.
I think for taxation in particular, there's fairly good data about the effect that different types of taxes can have on alcohol use in itself. So what we did is we looked at, there's been some systematic reviews, there have been a couple of meta-analyses, and so we used a range of estimates from these. We looked at, from different extremes of estimates based on these different studies, mostly based on, either natural experiments or other types of observational studies, looking at changes in taxes and their impact on drinking, and use those parameters to inform the model. One thing that you might say is that, for example, what might be more controversial, or not really controversial, but a lot cruder, is the literature on the effect of alcohol outlets on violence, and partly because all of that literature ignores this process, what I was talking about selection of bars, individual selection of bars, and so it attributes the whole effect to bars themselves, when in fact it may not be the bars themselves, it might be the riskier people congregated in certain bars. And so hopefully by modeling all of those processes of assortative selection of bars, we've been able to account for those other aspects that the estimates don't account for. But yes, one of the things that you have to think about with all of these models is what the strength of the literature is about the effect of the interventions that you're simulating is. And if there is not a lot of very strong evidence on it, you might want to look at a range of estimates and see how, to what extent your findings are robust to different assumptions about the magnitude of the effect. Does that answer your question? Okay, not 10 minutes left. So I just wanted to provide some insights into what we mean by the intervention. But basically, I'm not going to get into this, but basically that one of the things that we were concerned about taxation is that you can't just assume that taxation is going to have the same effect on everyone, right? So taxation is going to depend on what drinks you prefer to consume, and it's going to depend on your income, right? Your likelihood of changing your behavior based on the tax is going to depend on how much you can afford to spend on alcohol, and it's going to be affected by what liquor the tax is affecting, right? If you prefer beer and the tax is on liquor, maybe who cares, right? And so we wanted to actually account for that in our model. And so we actually use different elasticity estimates or different estimates of the change in drinking given price increases for alcohol based on the level of consumption, based on your income, and based on your beverage preference. Okay, so finally, now we've set up the model, we've run these simulations. What did we get? So these are the results for the first scenario. The first scenario was the effect of doing a universal alcohol tax, so taxing all beverages, and this is the effect on alcohol-related violent victimization, so non-fatal violent victimization. On the x-axis is different types of scenarios. Remember, I said one of the nice things about these models is that you can simulate different doses of an intervention, right? Something you couldn't do in reality. You could say, okay, well, to what extent would I have to increase the tax in order to get any kind of effect that I care about? So this is different scenarios of increases in price as a result of the universal alcohol tax. And on the y-axis is the average annual alcohol-related violent victimization. And so what you can see is that there is a fairly strong response where as you tax alcohol more, there's a pretty high decrease in non-fatal violent victimization. And then the asterisks represent whether the estimates are significantly different from the no intervention scenario. And then if we look at, that was non-fatal victimization, this is homicide, and this is homicide by race. So here you have blacks and blue, whites and red. So here again you can see that the universal tax resulted in a pretty large decrease in homicide, but also what's interesting is that it seemed to close the black-white gap in homicide, something that we were particularly interested in. What about if you said, okay, well, you know, you're never going to tax all alcohol. That's ridiculous. Nobody's going to accept that. What if we just tax beer? Okay, so this is a scenario where we just tax beer. And again, we see a smaller but still significant decrease in the rate of alcohol-related violent victimization and in the decrease in alcohol-related homicide and a slight closing of the black-white gap, but smaller, of course, than you would find with the universal alcohol tax. Okay, what if you just closed outlets altogether? What would be the effect of that on alcohol-related violent victimization?
None.
None, right? No, nothing, absolutely. For the effect of closing outlets on homicide disparities, any effect?
Well, a little.
A little, but anything to write home about?
No.
Probably not, right? And earlier closing times, again, nothing for non-fatal victimization or for homicide. Okay? So this simulation suggests that based on the assumptions that we made, which I've shown you all the dirty laundry about, universal alcohol taxes and beer taxes could result in a substantial decrease in alcohol-related violent victimization, but interventions on alcohol outlets themselves may have very little impact. So taxation may be an effective way to reduce violence.
Did you also look at the effects on just taxing other types of beverages, like wine and liquor?
We haven't looked at that yet. We haven't, yeah, but that's one of our next steps. Yeah,
very, very interesting, because I'm a little familiar with the literature, but for example, in Germany there used to be like these alcopops, like lemonade essentially with hard liquor, and then there was a specific tax on those kind of beverages, and that didn't reduce the consumption because people were just switching to like mixing them themselves again, or switching to wine, or so I'm curious what those results would look like, because it's always like the alcohol industry will rather push for a tax on a specific beverage because then people can switch over to a different kind. So overall, a universal tax is obviously less preferred by the industry.
Right. Yeah. So those are some of the things we need to look into. Another thing that you might wonder about is when we looked at closing outlets, we looked at just closing all outlets, right? But you might think that the real driver might not be closing restaurants, right? Because restaurants are not really going to generate a lot of violence, but bars might be. So another thing that we're working on now is focusing particularly on bars, separating out bars from restaurants, and looking at the effect of closing those outlets. So I have more information on model validation, but we're pretty much out of time, so I'm not going to get into it. But I'm happy to share these slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards, or you can email me. But basically, I think just to summarize, I think that agent-based models are a very nice complementary tool that we can use within our toolbox of methods that we use in epidemiology. I think they're useful in terms that they can help us create these virtual experiments to answer questions we can't ask feasibly or with our current set of resources with actual experiments. They're a nice way to account for the roles that space, social networks, and selection of context play in shaping health, and helping us understand the roles that those have, if any, in driving the patterns of behavior and the patterns of health. And they can help us identify optimal doses or packages of policies and interventions. Something that I haven't shown is that another thing that we're looking at is how packages of multiple interventions together can affect different types of health outcomes that we're interested in. And I think really the way forward is to better integrate system science methods. So for example, there was a question about network analysis. So integrate agent-based models with network analysis with systems dynamic models. To use these models to better account for interaction between social networks, broader sets of environmental characteristics and individual behaviors, to improve the utility that these models can have for predicting the potential effect of policies, and to generate new questions that can be tested through observation and experiments. I think really the ideal would be to be able to do these models, generate hypotheses about the data that we need, about what potential interventions might work, then get the money to actually do an experiment, and then use that experiment to inform another agent-based model, and do a constant iterative process between simulation and the collection of actual data. And so, in terms of, there's a lot of additional resources that you can use. This was just a very conceptual introduction into the types of questions you may ask with these models, into the types of processes you would follow to set up these models. But if you want to actually go ahead and implement an agent-based model yourself, I would advise you to take some of the great courses that there are available in actual programming of these models. One really great course taught by a colleague of mine is the Agent-Based Models for Population Health in the Columbia University Epidemiology Summer Institute. It's taught by Melissa Tracy. There's also an online course in Coursera taught by the University of Michigan, which is a really nice introduction. You could just do yourself into agent-based models. And then I would recommend looking at this website, again, set up by Columbia, that has a lot of nice resources in terms of courses and articles and websites, etc., that you can look into more. And I would like to thank my collaborators and funders for this work. So thank you. I'm happy to stay later for any questions.